If the cosmos has always been, if there was no beginning, what would be the condition of the cosmos? It would be totally disordered. Some of you who are interested in cosmology may realize that the black hole is the classic endpoint of order. Eventually, everything would become completely and totally disordered. That is not the condition of the cosmos. Therefore, we have not always been. Now, in the little chart that you see on the screen right now, you see the three basic evidences that we have attempted to present to you. There are many, many, many others. But I think it's important to move on in our discussion and realize, okay, let's suppose we are agreed that there was a beginning. I'm not suggesting that this presentation has been so overpowering that you automatically accept that, but I think if you look at other sources and people who perhaps did a better job than I did, at all the picture you'll see there is good support there was a beginning to the cosmos as a whole. This raises another question. And both the atheist statements and the statements of believers agree on this next process, have recognized it. Our top statement, which remember comes from a well-known atheist publication, says the universe is not only eternal, but self-existing and not created. You see, the concept there is that it is uncaused. Now, interestingly enough, in the biblical perspective, there is great care given to give a juxtaposition to that. We have up right now a chart of the Hebrew words in Genesis. And in that listing of words, there is a word for God and there is a word for created. And I said to you before that we don't quote the Bible to prove anything here, but it does an eloquent job of expressing the choices. The word for God is the word Elohim. Now that's important because there are many, many different Hebrew words that could have been used for God, but the word chosen, Elohim, in Genesis 1:1, is the word that conveys the wisdom and the power and the strength of God. Words like Yahweh in the original language indicate the promises of God, or Adonai recognize the ruling aspect of God, but the word chosen is a word that reflects the power, the creative wisdom, the design of God. It is used with the Hebrew word bara, B-A-R-A. The word bara is never used in reference to something a human being can do in the Hebrew language. It is always used only in reference to something that God can do. So Elohim, the God of power, of strength, of wisdom, created a process that only God can do. That's cause. In the beginning, God created the heaven. The word shahim refers to heaved up things. You remember our discussion of the expanding universe, the fact that everything is moving away from everything else? Isn't it interesting that the one word in Hebrew that would accurately describe the process of the movement of the cosmological objects is used? It's also interesting that the word eretz, the word that's used for earth here, is not a word that refers to some glob of gook floating through space, but that it actually is a demonstration of a working, functional earth. And all of the scientific evidence that we have supports that. Now it's important to understand that our basic thrust here has to do with the question of whether there was a beginning and whether the beginning was caused. But the rest of the statements in Genesis 1:1 are scientifically testable, totally, completely accurate statements describing the nature of the cosmos. And later we'll come back and take a look at those statements in more detail. Now we have a little flow sheet in front of you right now, which I hope will help clarify the argument for you. If you admit you exist, which we discussed in the first program, the question is, was there a beginning or was there no beginning? We've, I think, shown a considerable amount of evidence there was a beginning, and there's much else out there. All right, if we accept that, was the beginning caused or was it not caused? Now there's an interesting perspective here because when you start looking at the atheist proposition here, I think you run into a big problem. And that big problem is the question or the logic of looking at this question of something not being caused. And the important perspective here is to ask the question of where does it take you if you take the position that something can come from nothing? You see, I've heard atheists and skeptical writers say, well, how do you know that something can't just come from nothing by some process we know nothing about. That's the safest argument in the world. I mean, anytime you argue from ignorance, you are safe. And I don't say that in a denigrating way. If your argument is based upon something we don't know, then there is never an answer to the question. So it's a very safe argument. But I suggest to you that this particular question ends up discarding all of science if you take this position. Because if something can come from nothing, whether it's a weird new process or not, then there are major scientific problems. For example, if something can come from nothing, then the law of conservation of matter energy is wrong, which means everything in chemistry is wrong. I had a student one time who said, "Oh, now I understand why I have trouble with chemistry." No, that's not the reason. You end up discarding all known chemistry if the conservation laws don't work. If something can come from nothing, then the law of conservation of angular momentum is wrong, which means everything in physics is wrong. If something can come from nothing, then the law of conservation of electric charge is wrong, which means everything in electronics is wrong, which means your computer doesn't work. Now, your computer may not work, but that's not the reason. All scientific knowledge goes in a trash can if you take the position that something can come from nothing. And I would submit to you that that's a very unusual position for someone to take who is maintaining that, in fact, we can intelligently and logically discard the notion of God. We had a beginning, and the beginning was caused. And I think it's important to recognize that these statements are statements based upon logic and understanding and clarity. One last question, one that will take some time. Okay, if there was a beginning, and the beginning was caused, then what was the cause? Now, it's important to recognize that when we start talking about this question, we're dealing with something very, very different. Because if there was, in fact, an intelligence that created the creation, something that is personal in nature, a God, then there are certain attributes that we would expect to see in the creation. And some of those attributes are intelligence, purpose, design, things that would radiate the intelligence and the purpose behind it. On the other hand, if we're looking at something that is not personal, then the question becomes very different. Because if we do not have a personal intelligence